Tribune Jayan Mar-Laxia sat at the bar, nursing his drink while the usual crowd of cadets and civilians drank and sang the war songs of the Grand Coalition. He had been a soldier in the Grand Coalition armies for almost 70 galactic years. In that time, he'd risen from the lowest rank to commanding a KARK of 100,000 troops. His loyal service earned him a promotion to tribune, and he was given the option to retire or choose his next assignment. The service was all he knew, so he accepted the offer to teach at the academy. Jayan drank alone most of the time, as most cadets were too intimidated to approach him outside of class. His rank, experience, or sheer size kept them at a distance. Unlike most of the academy instructors, Jayan was one of those mythical beings, a combat veteran of many wars. Most instructors had some combat experience, but usually just one or two conflicts. As part of his interview with the academy commandant, his service record was reviewed, and Jayan was surprised by some of the details. After 70 years of combat service, it all blurred together. He had fought in 22 wars, 642 major engagements, numerous skirmishes, and more than a few barroom brawls. He shrugged at the last one. Jayan had come up through the ranks and became an officer by battlefield commission. He wasn't an officer and an aristocrat like most of the cadets he taught. Standing nearly 3 meters tall and massively muscled like all soldiers from Axia, Jayan's body was crisscrossed with numerous scars, especially on his forearms, and the curled horns on his head added to his imposing appearance. So, he was surprised when a cadet from the newest class approached him, clearly pushed by his friends. Tribune Mar-Laxia, the young Karen stuttered. "Yes, cadet?" Jayan replied, trying to remember the cadet's name. "See Cadet Sin, sir," the young cadet answered. "Oh yes, what can I do for you, cadet?" Jayan inquired, trying to keep from smiling at how scared the cadet looked, ears flat, tail tucked between his legs, and barely able to look up at him. "Sir, if it's okay," the cadet asked, trying to overcome his nervousness. "We were talking about who were the best soldiers in the coalition military." "Is that all?" Jayan chuckled. "And how do you mean the best?" "The best fighters, the bravest warriors, the strongest soldiers, the canniest troopers, or the most reliable to get the job done." The cadet looked to his friends for help, but none was given. I don't know, sir," his voice barely audible. Jayan smiled and decided to take pity on the young cadet. He took a pull from his drink and signaled the bartender for another. As she slid the drink to him, she shared that amused look she always had when he was going to tell a tale. After another pull at his fresh drink, he put it down and turned around on his stool. "You ask about the best soldiers in our military, but I will instead tell you of my experience with the best soldiers that I've ever fought beside." The rest of the bar's patrons quieted down as they realized they might get to hear him share some of his past experiences. They weren't part of our military but one of the few allies willing to step up when the Razi invaded our space. Jayan's eyes stared at nothing as he tried to remember how long ago it was. About 30 cycles ago, it was. They'd sent a large force against a small colony world, Raza. He paused, taking another pull from his drink before continuing. "I was just a Kiliad then, commanding a Milan arch of heavy infantry. The entire Taka had been sent to evacuate the civilians before the Rith arrived. At the time, most of us thought sending 10,000 soldiers to evacuate 6,000 civilians was overkill." He shook his head before continuing, "But we hadn't met the Razi in combat before." Jayan looked around the room before continuing. "Cadets learn about the Razi in their 3rd year, so for the younger cadets and the civilians in the room, I better explain who the Rith were. The Rith were a species that originated from the fringe of the Zentik sector out on the galactic rim. That area had never been explored, being so far out. It was later found to have contained several sapient species, all conquered by the Rith." "What did they look like?" one of the cadets piped up. Jayan turned to look at the cadet. "They were big, only slightly shorter than me. Their lower body was sinuous, and having no legs, they moved by lateral undulation. Their dorsal side was covered in short spikes that ended in a stinger that could inject paralytic venom in some species. They had 2 arms that ended in a 6-digit manace with retractable claws and another pair of appendages that could function as arms for grasping or be used to increase their speed when moving. They had two sets of eyes, one for normal light and the other for low light night. They had a wide maw with rows of sharp fangs for ripping apart flesh and meat. Their whole body was covered in tough scales that sometimes deflected laser and plasma bolts if you didn't hit them square on. Draining his mug, Jayan continued, to them, other sapients were either food or slaves. He looked around to see the entire bar focused on him. A delegation sent to make contact after they attacked a small outpost found that out the hard way. Only one of the group was allowed to live to deliver a single message, surrender or die. The Gitana Council didn't take them seriously and put together a small fleet to punish these upstarts. After all, the survivor reported they only had a dozen ships. None came back. Jayan drained the rest of his drink and set the mug on the bar. A recon ship that had been sent out returned with word that the Rith fleet was far larger than reported, hundreds of capital ships, thousands of escorts, and what we assumed were troop ships. With our fleet scattered across coalition territory, we needed to buy time for them to join the Grand Fleet. So dozens of squadrons were sent to evacuate all colonies and stations directly in the enemy's path, Jayan said, his eyes staring at nothing as he spoke. We didn't know the Razi had also sent out their groups of raiders to seize any supplies they could, and in their case, the colonists were just another source of food. Jayan began to reach for his mug, remembering it was empty just before grasping it, so he was pleasantly surprised to find it full again. So our small fleet reached Raza 6 and took orbit above the main settlement. A message had been sent for the colony to gather all their people in the main settlement and be evacuated from there. With none of our ships capable of atmospheric maneuvering, we were reduced to using shuttles and other smaller craft to load the colonists and their belongings. It would take some time to lift 6,000 colonists, their animals, and a few belongings to the ships in orbit. Jayan gave a small chuckle as he remembered the argument between the fleet commander and the Taka over the colonists' animals. He'd finally convinced the fleet commander that they were there to rescue the colonists and deny the Rith of supplies. Being carnivorous, the colonists' animals were a food supply for them and couldn't be left behind. He also pointed out that simply destroying them to the point of being inedible would take too long, agitate the colonists, and significantly slow down the evacuation time more than just taking the animals would. One of the older cadets spoke up, "Sir, you okay?" bringing Jayan back to the present. "I apologize. I was lost in a memory." Now, where was I? He thought out loud. "Ah yes, the evacuation," he said. "We'd been at it for several centaks when we received word of hostile ships entering the system. The fleet commander took all but 2 destroyers to engage the enemy while we tried to speed up the evacuation, but you can only move so fast with the number of shuttles we had." Taking another pull of his drink, Jayan thought to himself, "Good thing it isn't very strong, or I'd be under a table before I am done." My Taka conferred with the fleet commander, and a distress signal was sent out for more ships to assist in the effort. He was also informed of several ships heading for the planet's surface, most likely ground troops. The area around the settlement wasn't very defensible, so we moved the LZ to a nearby plateau and moved the rest of the colonists that way. The colonists would often take their livestock to graze on the top of the plateau, so there was a well-worn path, and even better, some of the livestock naturally began to climb the trail to their grazing spot. The path up was mostly rock and dirt, with some vegetation here and there, he continued. It leveled off into 3 different benches as you ascended. This allowed a brief rest for some of the slower colonists. The plateau was bulbous where the pathway exited on it, sheer cliffs along nearly all sides provided added protection, and the land narrowed to a bluff over the river far below. A wide spot at the farthest end of the bluff was just big enough for an LZ, his hands helped show the size and shape of the area. Placing our troops to delay and block the advancing Rith, we successfully gave the colonists enough time to reach the top of the plateau, with me and my men covering their retreat. The Rith commander was smart and held back his forces when he realized we were retreating to higher ground, so we were able to hold them long enough for the last of the colonists to reach the top of the plateau. We could see their landing craft drop off troops on the other side of the settlement, Jayan said, remembering the firefight that ensued when the Rith's first wave tried to force its way up. With most of the colonists secured and only a single approach to defend, we had a better defensive position than before, but there were a lot of them and few of us, he emphasized. The Rith didn't mind taking losses as long as they got their food. As I said earlier, the Rith commander was smart and didn't just charge us with overwhelming numbers, he sent probing attacks until he found where our strongest points were and our weak spots. He paused and remembered to sip his drink before continuing. Just as we had finished setting up a basic defense and had the LZ running at full capacity, one of the colony's communication officers suddenly announced a signal. The fleet commander had left strict orders that we were to do nothing but cover the evacuation, but it was an open comm signal, so it couldn't hurt to listen. Then we realized the signal was from a vessel that we didn't recognize, definitely not from any of our allies. Jayan closed his eyes, remembering the relief he'd felt when he learned that someone, anyone, was going to help them. I couldn't understand the message, but the communication officer went as pale as a Rethi. They recognized the dialect, it was from a race of beings that most considered mythical. "Sir, did they make contact?" one of the cadets asked. Jayan simply nodded. Yes, the fleet commander sent back an acknowledgement. "We were informed that a small task force was in system and would arrive shortly," he replied, giving no further information about the comm. My detachment held off the Rith attack long enough for some of the transport ships to land on the plateau. With the Rith trying to envelop the rear of our defenses, we couldn't hold the LZ as they swarmed from the settlement and across the river. Many of us were injured and tired, running out of ammo or plasma packs. Just as I gave the order to hold at all costs, I saw some new contacts on my HUD. 5 new dots had just appeared and were closing rapidly. Pausing to take a pull from his drink, Jayan continued, "The fleet commander gave orders to protect those landing. I called for a retreat to the plateau's second bench as the LZ was about to be overrun. Just as the rear guard began to retreat, the 5 new dots were now close enough to identify. I could only see one of the new ships, as the rest stayed in orbit." "What did they look like?" another cadet called out. Jayan thought for a moment before answering. "The ship I saw was small, only about 200 meters in length, shaped like an elongated egg with a more pointed nose. There were no apparent weapons, but just as they passed over the enemy, one of the Rith ships simply ceased to exist." Jayan paused to take another pull from his drink. One moment there, and the next, nothing. No explosion or smoke. Just gone. The fleet commander ordered the Rith ships to be engaged, and the 4 remaining dots went about their business. None of them fired any weapons, at least not that I saw. 2 of the dots went down the Rith flank, which caused them to halt their attack and pull back. Jayan could see the cadets and civilians in the room lean forward in anticipation as he paused for a moment to take another drink. The Rith pulled back, but only slightly. They were still between us and the LZ, which meant we still had to fight our way out. The Rith commander must have thought we had reinforcements, as we were able to retake the LZ relatively quickly. The 5 dots went out of sight after a few moments, but the damage they had done to the Rith was far greater than anything we could have managed. As we set up a defensive perimeter, the Rith regrouped and launched another attack. They seemed more desperate this time, possibly believing they could end the battle before the rest of the unknown forces returned. They attacked in waves, one after another, but this time their numbers were visibly reduced, and their formations were much sloppier. The Rith were no longer the disciplined force we had faced before, they had turned into a rabble, and they were starting to break. We held out long enough for the evacuation to be completed, but we were losing people fast. The Rith were getting more and more desperate, and it was getting harder to hold them off. Jayan paused, remembering the fear and exhaustion he had felt at that moment. Then, just as it seemed we would be overrun, the 5 dots returned. This time, they didn't just pass by. They landed. The room was silent as everyone waited for Jayan to continue. The 5 dots turned out to be drop pods, and out of each pod came what I can only describe as a nightmare. They were humanoid, about 2.5 meters tall, and clad in armor that seemed to absorb light. They carried weapons I had never seen before, and they moved with a speed and precision that was terrifying to watch. The Rith didn't stand a chance. These beings tore through them like they were nothing. The Rith were slaughtered, and those who tried to retreat were cut down before they could take more than a few steps. It was over in minutes. Jayan paused, remembering the awe and terror he had felt watching these beings in action. After the last of the Rith were killed, one of the beings approached me. I was expecting some sort of demand, but all they did was hand me a data chip. They didn't say a word, they just turned and left. The pods took off, and the ships disappeared from our scanners. We were left standing there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The data chip contained a simple message: your debt is paid. And that was it. They were gone, and we were left to wonder who they were and why they had helped us. The room was silent as Jayan finished his story. The cadets and civilians were left with more questions than answers, but none dared to ask them. Jayan drained the last of his drink and stood up. "That's enough for tonight," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Remember, the best soldiers are not always the ones who are the strongest or the bravest. Sometimes, the best soldiers are the ones who show up when you need them the most, even if you don't know why they are there." With that, Jayan turned and left the bar, leaving the cadets and civilians to ponder the mysterious allies who had come to their aid all those years ago.